Oh, I always like this one. Let's listen to this. It's the orchestral album. Okay, so before we start, let me link you guys. This is the archive that I'm basically following, and this is what this is what I reference when I need to look something up. So you guys can have that link if you need it, if you want to look up stuff yourself. Like I said, I had a bunch of slides, but they got really foobar, so we're just gonna do it like this, and we're just gonna have it be a discussion. All right, let's get started. I'm glad you guys joined me for this. This should be a lot of fun. Like I said, it can be a discussion, so if you guys have comments, leave them, and I'll try to get to them if I see them. Okay, so I talked earlier about how the purpose of this is supposed to be sort of an analysis of Heavensward as a whole. What worked well, what didn't work well, for the purpose of deciding what we want to see in Stormblood. The best way to do this is we're going to be going through each patch one by one, starting with patch 3.0. We're not going to look at the Realm Reborn stuff. I may reference some of the Realm Reborn stuff, but only for the purpose of highlighting what was different in Heavensward. And I think mostly that would happen when I start talking about patch 3.0 here. Patch 3.0 was the beginning of Heavensward, and when we're looking at patch 3.0, the stuff that I want to look at are what changed in the new expansion. So we had 3 new jobs, and the only time that we had ever had a job introduced to Realm Reborn, not to 14, but to Realm Reborn, prior to that was Ninja. And if you think back to patch 2.4 when Ninjas were released, how did that shake things up? The short answer is, it didn't shake up much. It shook up the rating meta, if you can call it a rating meta. It shook it up at a very isolated level where it only really affected your melee. Before Ninjas, you had the compositions of Double Monk being really strong. A lot of times, Monk Dragoon wasn't really favored just due to the fact that Dragoons throughout Realm Reborn had very poor magic defense. So when you had the opportunity to run 2 melee, you typically favored 2 monks. If you weren't interested in doing a double melee comp, you had your single melee with triple ranged, which saw a lot of play. A lot of teams throughout Final Coil and Second Coil ran 3 ranged. The double Black Mage Bard comp was pretty prominent, and even Summoners back in Second Coil. Summoners were really strong in Second Coil. So we have patch 2.4 where Ninja's released, and it changes how the melee are now approaching fights. We have a melee that has added an entire new level of group utility. The game prior to Ninjas had very little group utility. Trick Attack was the first step I think that Square Enix took to creating a level of teamwork that can actually transcend things like composition. And this was really important because this is going to shape how 3.0 played out. The introduction of Ninja, I think, is one of the most important things to happen to Final Fantasy rating. Trick Attack was extremely pivotal. So back to Heavensward in 3.0, we have entire 3 new jobs released. We have Machinist, we have Dark Knight, and we have Astrologian. Now, ignoring the current state of the game, try to look at 3.0 as if it's 3.0 right now. Astrologians are dirt awful. They are just gutter trash. There is no saving them right now. The only time the Astrologian was ever a part of the conversation was for a span of 40 seconds in A4 Savage. That's it. It was awful other than that. So we're not gonna really look at Astrologian right now. At a very early point, it was decided that it was just not good, and White Mage throughput just crushed it. The most interesting part of the new classes in 3.0 was definitely Dark Knight. Dark Knight had the most impact out of the initial three. Machinist was building off of the idea of Ninja, and building on that group utility. However, the most impactful new job of 3.0 was by far Dark Knight, and we're gonna look at why that was. When 3.0 started, there were a lot of question marks surrounding Dark Knight. A lot of the people who were testing it and trying it, turn the music down a little bit. A lot of people that were doing the initial tests for it were kind of on the fence about it. There was only a handful of us, at least specifically on Gilgamesh, and I can only speak for Gilgamesh, but there was only a handful of us on Gilgamesh that felt that Dark Knight was going to see play in Gordias. And one of the reasons for this was One of the reasons for this is Square Enix gave us 2 weeks prior to Savage being released to practice normal. And in normal, you can see a lot of things like damage types, fight lengths and phases, is this fight heavy on ads, is this fight not heavy on ads? Stuff like that is pretty useful information from normal. And why is that relevant to Dark Knight? Well, Dark Knight, prior to Dark Knight, you have Paladin and Warrior, and what Dark Knight does different than either of those two, with the exception of maybe Warrior, is the 60-second Dark Mind completely changes how you approach magic mitigation and how you set up tanky rotations for that. And when you look at Gordias, what are the two things that sort of stand out? Let's think about how Gordias behaved. Let's first think about A1. A1, you have I think the two bosses where you had Oppressor and you had Oppressor 0.5. Now, let's think about what kind of composition was really good for A1. Because going into A1, people were blind right now. We were really blind to what the meta was going to be. We had like brief ideas of what was going to be good, but we didn't know what the tier was going to end as. So let's just pretend that it's 3.0 and we're going into A1 blind right now. All we know is that there's two bosses and that every minute or so there's a big magic tank buster. That's all we know. If you think about A1, there was very little reason to think Paladin. The magic tank busters were so blatant and obvious and thrown in your face by Square Enix that they were practically begging you to take Dark Knight. So this was the first sort of experience that the community had with Dark Knight in a raid, and it almost felt forced. Paladin, unless you're killing the boss extremely fast and like a speed kill, really didn't have the utility that a Dark Knight did in terms of mitigation, in terms of mitigating that fight. We're not even thinking about damage right now. All we're thinking about is damage mitigation. You have the Oppressor and the Oppressor 0.5. We know what kind of tanks we want to bring. Let's think about the DPS now. The stereotypical DPS setup prior to that was Monk, Ninja, Black Mage, Bard. That was like, at some points you could, post Dragoon buffs, you would have Dragoon, Ninja, Black Mage, Bard. But before the Dragoon magic defense buffs, it was mostly Monk, Ninja, Black Mage, Bard. You just really couldn't make an argument for bringing a Dragoon with its poor magic defenses it had before the buffs in 2.5. Now, when you bring a Ninja into A1, it's not nearly as strong as it was in, say, Final Call. And why is that? That's because the driving force of Ninja, well, there's two driving forces back then when TP was actually a thing. The two driving forces of Ninja were Goad and Trick Attack. If you think about how Trick Attack behaves on A1, unless you're doing a very overgeared speed kill, the uptime of Trick Attack for your party of 8 players is a lot smaller than if you were just attacking a single boss. Because you have to split the rate up 4 and 4 practically. This does devalue Ninja on A1. Now, if you think about what that does to the rest of the party composition, it's going to place stronger value on other classes. Battle Litany is a thing that is essentially, room wide. You could say, in a sense that it's going to affect both bosses, both oppressors. So Battle Litany is definitely is a utility for your group that it becomes highly valued. And when you have Monk, because you have the 2 extra adds, because you have the 2 bosses, you can't have the same debuff. You can't have a full uptime debuff on both bosses unless you're ping-ponging between bosses as a Dark Knight, and that sounds miserable. So the bringing of a Monk to A1 now becomes very useful in that you can have Dragon Kick on one mob and Delirium on the other boss. So A1, I think, creates this really cool dynamic where all 3 melee have a very important role in it. If you're progging it at a very early stage, having double intellect downs on both bosses is pretty important. So the concept of bringing a Monk to the fight has a much higher value than, say, on a single target boss like a Bahamut Prime or something. And something like you're then weighing Battle Litany versus Trick Attack, it created this really good dynamic. I think A1 was a fantastic start to the tier because outside of the fact that they said "fuck you, Paladin," log on your Dark Knight, I think that it was a really good entry level boss because each multiple party compositions had had similar levels of strengths, and I think that's really important and a really good way to start Heavensward. Moving ahead to A2, I don't want to talk about the healers member for A1 because, like I said earlier, we're not even thinking about Astrologian. Astrologian was so bad in this patch that we're actually going to just ignore its existence. So I want to look at A2 now, and why is it that we saw a lot of teams move away from Dark Knight on A2 at early stages of prog? And a lot of this has to do with the unknown. We just do not know what's good. We don't know where the meta is going to be. We don't know. We don't know the full capabilities and potential of Dark Knight yet. So, a lot of teams in A2 shifted back to what was comfortable with them. Throughout normal, we saw that it was a pretty predominantly physical damage fight. So mitigation-wise, the Paladin block rate made a lot more sense. When you have a lot of adds like that, Paladin is really strong. The DPS potential of Dark Knight was not fleshed out at that point. So what became obvious to us later, that Dark Knight is actually very strong in A2, was really not that obvious to a lot of teams early on. So you saw a lot of people shift back to Warrior and Paladin. DPS-wise, you started seeing the classes that had a lot of sustain. And one thing about 3.0 that we need to highlight is the complete inequality in abilities to sustain themselves. Prior to changes later, classes like Dark Knight were completely gutted for TP. It was abysmal being a Dark Knight sometimes, just because of the restrictions you had with your TP. If you did not have a ninja, your class was almost not viable. It was just nonsense. A lot of teams in A2, because of the self-sustain that Monk had, reverted back to their Monk favoritism, just in terms of the AoE that they could bring, and I can't remember the name of the TP ability that monks got in Heavensward. It's on the tip of my tongue. I'm just blanking right now. But the sustain of monks in A2 was very strong. Warriors included Equilibrium, extremely strong. Paladins didn't really have much AoE to begin with, so they weren't a concern. A lot of the focus on A2 was which classes can sustain themselves. Then you have the elephant in the room of Summoner. And to this day, I don't understand why they keep doing this. Why is it that every expansion, for whatever reason, they somehow let vulnerability abusing get by? They've gone out of their way multiple times in the past to rid themselves of that interaction. I mean, I think back to T12 in Final Coil, for example. They made it a top priority to remove the ability to vulnerability cheese that fight. And then not even 6 months later, we see it back, potentially even stronger than ever in A2. I just thought that was mind-blowing that they let that get released like that. A lot of teams, you saw a lot of summoners coming out of the woodwork. Vulnerability cheesing and snapshotting in that manner is something that I do not want to see in Sorblood. I hope it's dead and buried and just not a thing. It's not interesting. I don't care how the ingenuity behind it or coming up with it. It's just not interesting. It's extremely polarizing for both casual and hardcore groups alike. If you're on a more casual timetable in terms of rating, if you're not a summoner, you are essentially slowing down your group's progression at that point. Black Mage was really strong, but there is just no arguing of just how completely overpowered Summoner was in the early stages of A2. The funny story about my experience with A2 was our Black Mage didn't know how to play Summoner at the time. He knew how, but he wasn't nearly as good at it, so he actually just stayed on Black Mage and made us suffer for it. But vulnerability, snapshotting, and cheesing, I don't want to see return in Stormblood. I don't find it interesting at all. I think it's very polarizing. So A2, the name of the game was Sustain. And this is important because this is something that I'm going to highlight later when we think about the TP management and how TP has kind of evolved through Heavensward. So let's get to what everybody wants to talk about. And this is really where I think the focus of Gordias remains, and that's Living Liquid, because this is where we started seeing a lot of experimentation. This is what you want to see in a new expansion, and this is what I hope to see in 4.0 as well. Living Liquid was a boss with such a high wall, such a high DPS barrier that you had to cater your group around the fight to kill the fight. And it's sort of the first, I think a lot of us collectively agree that it's the first time in Final Fantasy XIV where they have tuned a fight so tightly that you cannot proceed in a timely manner. You cannot proceed without building your team comp around it. You can make arguments that things got close beforehand, but I don't think until A3 it was ever a necessity. There was always a conversation of, well, I could have done this better. My uptime here wasn't very good. There was always still that extra 5% that you could squeeze out of your group composition, and the tuning wasn't tight enough to where that would allow you to kill the boss. Do I think that Living Liquid is overtuned? No, I do not think it was overtuned. I think it was actually as close to perfectly tuned as they may have ever come with a fight. A fight that requires you to play perfectly without weapons in order to kill it is a perfectly tuned fight, I think. And it's something that I really hope that they try again in the future. I think that one of the big mistakes, and a lot of people in the chat may agree, one of the biggest mistakes they made with A3 was the fact that it was only the third boss. I think had the tuning level of A3 been applied to A4, and they, we'll get to A4 in a minute. I have a lot to say about that. But had A3 been in place of like the final boss of Gordias, I think that would have been quite possibly one of the best tuned tiers this game has ever had. And it's already up for running debate with for that being the case as is, even with the way that it turned out. But a lot of people are going to look at A4 and dispute that because of A4. So let's look at how A3 played out. A3, a lot of the teams went into it blind with their party compositions that they used in A2. The first cool thing about A3 was that A3 behaved very differently from its normal counterpart. And this was sort of the first time that was unexpected. A lot of us went into A3 after having seen how A1 and A2 played out. A lot of us went into A3 expecting A3 to behave similarly to the normal version. That definitely was not the case. The rotations, the phases, the damage types, they were all very different. The DPS check was obviously very different. So it's the first. A3 is the first fight of Heavensward where you really have to start experimenting, and some of the experimentations were pretty interesting. One thing that happened as a result is A3 was the birth of what later became known as the DPS comp, and that is the comp of Warrior, Dark Knight as your tanks, Dragoon, Ninja, Black Mage, Bard as your DPS, Scholar and White Mage as your healers. At the time of A3, that was the composition that put the highest raid DPS output available, and it became increasingly obvious that a composition like that was going to be necessary, to the point of you're sacrificing defensive utility to make it happen. And this is a big turning point for Final Fantasy, because this is the first point in Final Fantasy raiding where, as a progression raider, you're favoring offense to defense. Prior to that, every single encounter, the mantra for every high-end raiding team was effective HP over offense, because that's how you got through encounters at low gear levels. You wanted enough HP to skate by safely so that you can keep high uptime and get the DPS levels that you need. I never had a fight been tuned so much that wasn't enough. So in my eyes, and in a lot of people's eyes, A3 was the first instance where you had a shift in what we're going to call the meta. We're now in a meta where offense is trumping defense, and this was groundbreaking. I cannot stress to you how groundbreaking this was. What does this do? This giant shift in meta completely flips the hierarchy of power in the Final Fantasy raiding scene. You had teams that were so good at playing defensively that are now just flabbergasted and completely caught off guard. Then you have teams like back then it was the Lucrezias that were so well practiced in offense through all the final cool speed killing that they had done, that teams like them are not only remaining on top but becoming even better. And this was just massive for raiding in the raiding scene, both hardcore and not as hardcore alike. I don't want to necessarily call it casual, but it's sort of like a hardcore versus softcore mentality, but I'll just call it casual. But for hardcore and casual alike, this was such a massive shift. And to me, it's sort of sad that it gets frowned upon so much, because it's honestly one of the most impactful and, in my opinion, best things to happen to raiding in the game. Why is this important? Well, let's think about a meta where offense trumps defense. I highlighted just a minute ago, that when you're favoring a defensive playstyle, it gives you a lot more room for error. And when you have a lot more room for error, you can typically make a lot more mistakes and still get by. When I think back to our turn 12 kill, for example, this is the first time we ever got world first. One of the reasons that we were able to do it was we had so much of a health buffer through mantras and what do you call it? Mantra suckers. That getting through the fight at an early gear level, we did so just on HP alone. You know, DPS was never really a requirement. It's just live, 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 and you win. With Heavensward, that completely changed with A3, because now you have an environment where you have to live, 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 while DPS is still extremely important. And what does that mean for playstyles? That means that you're now having to balance maintaining maximum uptime while also doing all of the necessary mechanics and living through those mechanics. You're balancing offense and defense at the same time, whereas before you only were focusing on typically one of them. This was the best thing to happen to raiding, because in my eyes, the skill cap for raiding at a very early level skyrocketed. I think back to some of the ways that warriors were progressing through A3. I'm not going to include myself in this because I was still a little bit more defensive minded, having just come from Final Coil and stuff. But a lot of warriors I saw go through A3 were now having to maximize deliverance uptime while surviving huge tank busters and min-maxing cooldowns to allow us to do that. You know, Paladins and Dark Knights behave the same way. You know, min-maxing or balancing offense and defense while surviving the boss required a lot more skill and planning than, you know, sit Defiance, hit an IB, drop Defiance when you don't need IB. Like, it was just not even comparable. So I don't want to go too much into why I love A3, but I want to highlight why it's so important to the overall growth of Heavensward and just the rating as a whole. We talked a little bit about the DPS comp that sort of arose from A3. A3 was really funny to a lot of individuals because I remember reading on Reddit a lot, and you guys might remember this as well. There was just so much salt toward Dark Knight and Machinist and Astrologian before Gordias was released. A lot of people on Reddit just making blind claims that, oh, they'll never be viable, they'll never see play this tier. There's just A, not enough playtime on them. B, their utility doesn't trump what's already staple in the game. And I just think A3 is so hilarious because it completely disregarded all of those opinions and showed that, you know, going in with blind assumptions like that is really not going to get you anywhere. A lot of teams saw machinists come into the play in A3 because of the utility of hypercharge. A lot of teams that sort of favor their black mage damage a little bit more in the fight are going to favor Bard a bit more. But I remember there were a lot of teams that saw better returns out of Machinist compared to Bard just because the melee core of their team was the strength of their group. And hypercharge back then, while it was only 5% back then, was still a pretty large boon when you stack it with Blood for Bloods and IRs and stuff. But it was just really funny to me to think about how much A3 changed the game in terms of class composition and skill ceiling. Definitely one of the most favorable memories of Heavensward for me and a lot of people. So, having said all those wonderful things about A3 and the impact that it had, let's look at what was bad about it. Because while I do feel that there was a lot of good, there were some clear things that should have been different. And we highlighted this a little bit earlier, but I think that as I'm examining Gordias in reflection, a fight tuned as difficult as A3 was very difficult for the overall player base, and that reflected in the clear rate of that tier. A lot of statics broke up over A3, and I think that Square Enix has sort of learned from this by now. But for the purpose of our discussion, we're going to highlight it. The A3 as a third boss to the tier should never have been tuned as difficult as it was. It is perfectly tuned for a fight, but a perfectly tuned fight should exist as the final boss of the tier. I think had you put A3 as the final boss of the tier, I think the tier would have been much more well received. Not only is it more interesting than A4, and we'll get to A4 in a second, but I think it functions better tuning wise for the mass populace as a final boss of the tier. I didn't feel that way at the time, but now that I've had the year and a half plus to reflect on it, I do feel that would have been best for the game and the rating scene. So that's one thing that I think that could have changed. I know that Square Enix has learned from that. We all know that they've learned from that because we saw how Midas and Crater played out. So Stormblood, I don't think is going to behave anywhere near Gordias, but it's important that we think about what worked well and what didn't work well in our analysis. Other than that, I think A3. Oh, one thing that I liked about A3 that I do want to highlight and is something that I want to see them try to do in every boss that they make. A3 was an equal responsibility fight. Now, listen very carefully to what I said. A3 was an equal responsibility fight. This is so important for designing a good raid encounter, and they've more times than not have failed to reach this goal. The tanks had equal responsibility, the healers had equal responsibility, the DPS had equal responsibility between themselves. It's one of the best examples of an equal responsibility fight that you can actually put forth. Some of the later fights that I'm going to bring up in a second really failed to hit that mark, and we're definitely going to highlight that as being a problem. Okay, enough about A3. One of my favorite fights in the game, potentially my second favorite fight in the game, if not my first. Going to move on to A4 because A4 is one thing that it was sort of tier defining almost. As big of an impact as A3 had, A4 was almost tier defining. So let's talk about that. So A4, everyone has mixed feelings and memories about it. I can describe to you my team's feelings and memories about it, and then in the time we have afterwards, we can maybe talk about some of the rest of the community's feelings. A4 was a fight that took 4.5 weeks of prog, and I'm not using that description lightly. That is 4.5 weeks of progression of being inside, attacking the manipulator 7 days a week. Not every day was 16 hours, however, it was 4.5 weeks of 7 days a week. I think we took maybe 1 or 2 days off maximum over that entire time because people were back at work and school and stuff. But anytime that we were able to zone in, we zoned in, and that was really a deflating and annoying process because at a very early stage in that process, I think maybe the middle of the second week, we saw that the fight was just not killable. It was mathematically unkillable. And when you see how far you are off, and when you know where you need to be, it's very deflating. We saw our first A4 in Rage at, I believe, somewhere around 88% on Manipulator's core. And that was a really good pull. let me put it that. That was a really good pull. It was not a perfect pull by any stretch, but for the purpose of progression and getting through a fight, it was a good pull. 8 players alive. DPS wasn't maximized yet, obviously, but having 8 players alive and getting to a new phase means it's a good pull. And when you stand in Rage at 88%, our immediate collective reaction was, what the fuck just happened? Is this actually what's going on right now? And we tried to analyze: did we do something wrong? Did we trigger the enrage? Else how did we? Are we misunderstanding this enrage? Is this not an enrage at all? You start wondering about these things, and then you start thinking about the possibilities. Okay, we need to get back and we need to see it again, and we need to see where our DPS, our theoretical DPS can be, versus where we need it to be. And I think the final nail in the coffin to the full tilt The tilting moment was when we saw that the ads throughout the last phase reoccur. We went through one cycle of ads. I think we saw like a second cycle as we were dying, and then we knew, okay, all of our calculations for how much theoretical DPS we need are completely moot now because of the massive increase to effective HP that this raid boss has. You know, whenever you have a new ad cycle, unless you're able to ignore the ads, which in A4 you guys will remember that you couldn't ignore. They had a soft enrage. Unless you're able to ignore ads, you have to apply those ads HPs to the boss. And when you added up all the HPs of the remaining ads that are going to be throughout that phase, it became glaringly obvious that the fight was just mathematically not killable that week. And at that point, it's just a gear waiting game. You know, the fight had, for all intents and purposes, been solved. It just wasn't mathematically killable because the gear gate was so high. Now this has been beat to death over Reddit threads and discussions on even this stream. The intention for tuning A4 was to elongate the tier. That's been made pretty obvious, and I think they've almost said it. I think they've almost said that verbatim in a few of their live letters since. That the intention was for players to be have something to do for a long time. I can tell you from speaking to both my casual friends and my hardcore friends alike that this was uninteresting for all parties. Nobody likes not being able to kill a boss just because the stats in their character sheet are not at the number that they need to be. That's really not interesting. We want to be rewarded for good play, and you know we're an immediate what do you call it? We're a sort of a immediate satisfaction society. I can't think of the word I want to use right now, but we're an immediate satisfaction society where we want instant gratification. That's what I was trying to say. We're an instant gratification society where waiting and waiting for something that you already know you can do is just not interesting. And when you're playing a game, that's not a fun way to play a game. A4 was tuned way too high in terms of the DPS check required for it. And even more so, the one thing I haven't even talked about is, as ridiculous as the DPS check was, one of the things that made the DPS check so ridiculous was the HP check that was required. We had to make a lot of DPS sacrifices just to live some of the mechanics. And one of the things that I think that they really messed up on was tuning the HP requirement so high. And I think that they realized it after the fact as well, and that's why we saw Midas behave less differently than Gordias, and which was good. But as an opening to Heavensward, the first raid was super important. This is what brings in your player base. No, this is what not only brings in your player base. This is what retains your player base. And what we saw through the final stages of A3 and the entirety of A4 was a complete collapse of the raiding scene. Statics were breaking up left and right. They weren't having fun. People were unsubbing. Raiding was no longer fun. It was a chore. It was really not healthy for raiding in the game. And to Square Enix's credit, they did identify this, and they moved on from that kind of balance and design when they were designing raid tiers. Midas behaved a lot differently than Gordias, and honestly probably saved the game. There was a big cloud over raiding in this game shortly after 3.0 when you had a substantial drop off in the participation of raiding. So I think that is really important to look at when we're looking at Heavensward. So we've sort of talked about things that we didn't like about A4, things that worked well about A4. I mean, there weren't really a lot, I'm going to be honest. A4 was a pretty uninteresting fight. I will say that mechanically, one of the most famous mechanics of A4 was the Judgment Nissi. Mechanically, A4 was extremely fun. I thought juggling Nissi and stuff was extremely fun. I really disliked that they allowed for things like the stack strat to occur. That kind of showed how green they were to still designing encounters back then. You know, they weren't at a stage where they could anticipate what the player base was going to do. They were sort of, ever since Second Quill, and I said I wouldn't talk too much about Realm Reborn, but this is important. Ever since Second Quill, Square Enix has been playing catch up. They design a raid, they see what the player base does to that raid, and then they react. That happened in Second Quill, that happened in Final Quill, and that happened with Gordias. In Second Quill, they saw how we took apart Second Quill and started cheesing fights, and then they made Second Quill Savage. And it's so hilarious when you look at Second Quill Savage, because everything that the player base invented to cheese Second Quill, they specifically made it so you could not do that in Second Quill Savage. And it's just, it's hilarious. Look at Reflation, look at T9, and look at T8. Those are actually, and look at T7. All 4 fights, they removed the popular cheese method of being able to get through the fight and doing it simply. Like T8, you couldn't stack the missiles anymore. T7, you couldn't stack the Renauds anymore. Reflasia, you couldn't do the LOS strat. T9, T9, what did they do? They did something with Thunders. I can't remember exactly what they did with Thunders, but there was something that happened, an interaction with Thunder that they didn't allow. It was just the incorporation of a second Thunder sort of made it a bit more complicated. So I get maybe less so T9, but the other 3 for sure. My point is, the development team was playing catch up to the player base, and I think until the very late stages of Midas, that remained true. Some of the things I'll highlight in Midas reflect that, but I really wish that in order for Gordias to have been the perfect tier, they needed to have more foresight to what their player base was capable of. And it was really evident that they were not fully there yet with that in Gordias. Oh yeah, you guys are right. That's a really good example. The meteors in T9, you could not really handle them in the way that most groups were handling them in non-Savage. Yeah, that's what it was. But yeah, thinking to A4, there was more bad than good, I'm going to be honest. I think Gordias is a very favorable memory of mine, but a lot of it stems from A3. Not much of it stems from A4, other than the fact that, A4 was a culmination of 5.5 weeks of work, so completing it felt amazing. And maybe that's something that we should highlight before we move on, is while we don't want tiers that require you to have a certain number on your character sheet just to live a mechanic or kill a DPS through a phase, we do want fights to still feel rewarding, and this will be an important topic later on for obvious reasons. Making things have too low of a barrier of entry, too small a barrier of entry, you then have the opposite problem of now there's no fulfillment. And while A4 provided quite possibly the most fulfilling feeling teams had when they completed it, if they were to go the opposite route, you would have an inverse reaction of, I don't feel anything. So they need to find a balance. And one of the segues into the next tier is balance. I think not the balance that you guys are familiar with now, but balance in terms of tuning. Midas is where they started to learn. And I think that Midas is quite possibly, with the exception of 1 or 2 things, the best designed tier that they have come up with. Before we get into Midas, we need to look at where the game stands going into Midas. We have a lot of changes from the ending of 3.0 to the beginning of 3.2. In the filler patch 3.1, we saw changes to Monk, and we saw changes to TP and Sustain. You have Dark Knights now completely redesigned in their TP spending. I'm trying to remember it. As I recall, it was a blood weapon now scaled their TP down to reflect the increased GCD rate, which was imperative for Dark Knight sustain and DPS. You just had small reductions across the board. I think like Bards saw just a global reduction in their TP costs. I think Ninjas saw a reduction in their TP costs. You just saw a lot of attention on sustain and making sure that classes that were previously getting fucked were now being able to sustain themselves a bit more. Now, this is a double-edged sword because what happened starting with Midas is that they went too far to the other side of the spectrum. They reduced TP to a rate to where TP wasn't even a product of the conversation anymore. We had classes that could sustain themselves for double the length that they could before, and the concept and practice of TP management became non-existent. I to this day don't think that the TP system is fully recovered, and it's nice to see that they're looking at that in Stormblood and changing how that's gonna work with the proposed battle system changes that they've been hinting at. Because as it stands right now, TP is such a mindless resource. It doesn't have the management that it did in Realm Reborn in the early stages of Heavensward. It's just a shell of its former self, and at this point, it's just a nuisance more than anything. It's archaic is the best way to describe it. If they're going to have the game focus so little on resource management as it currently does for some classes, then just don't even put that resource in there to begin with. Come up with a different resource. So I hope this before I get into Midas, I hope this soundtrack, this opera Final Fantasy VI soundtrack, is not like dominating my voice. I guess while I'm looking at the sound levels, if you guys have your opinions about A4 or Gordias as a whole, or leading up to patch 3.1, leading up to patch 3.2, now's a great time to list them. Like I said, after each raid, I kind of want to look at opinions and comments that you guys are leaving. So I think that as soon as this sound moves on, alright, I'm going to lower the sound a little bit just because I don't have to deal with it later. Alright, that should be better. So let's look ahead to... How can I mute your voice? I want music only. You can do that by going to www.youtube.com and typing in Final Fantasy Orchestral. Okay, so let's look at the game going into 3.2. Like I said, we saw a lot of reductions to TP costs across the board. Am I going to VOD this later so I can watch? So you can watch? Yes. This will all go on YouTube. That's kind of the reason I'm formatting it the way I am. One of the biggest changes to 3.2 was the balance changes that preceded it. People are saying that Gordias wasn't very fun after progression, but I think it was very good at throwing the community to the wolves. A lot of the players became much better as a result. I certainly agree. However, where I have pause is, while that was true for the upper echelon of the game, it was way too polarizing for the rest of the game. Like I said, going through Gordias, I did not feel this way. This is only after I've had a year and a half to reflect about it, and I've seen how the game has unfolded. I think it was too polarizing, and the reason for that is because of what I saw in Midas. Midas was a tier that was able to throw players to the wolves and allow them to get better, but for completely different reasons. And this is where Square Enix first started learning about how to design a good tier. And tiers like Midas leave me extremely hopeful for what they can accomplish in Stormblood. Hopefully. And so I want to highlight what was good and what wasn't good in Midas so that we can look for the similarities in the good and hopefully find them in Stormblood. So we need to talk about the changes that led up to 3.2, like I've been alluding to. One of the biggest changes going to the patch, and I think it was actually the day of the raid tier, was the machinist change. I'm trying to remember exactly what they did in machinist. One of the biggest change they did in machinist was hypercharge went from being 5% to 10%, and this is going to be a reoccurring theme of Square Enix, unfortunately, going a little too ham with buffs. When they see a class underrepresented, for some reason, historically, their initial reaction has been to just buff it to twice its natural potency, to like almost force people to look at the job. Like Machinist is like, now look at me, I'm extremely good now. Square Enix is like, look at the Machinist and use it, and it was a little strong. You already had Machinists being pretty comparable to Bards. I think a lot of times, me personally, I favored Bard to Machinist in Gordias, but for a lot of teams, Machinist was pretty comparable to Bards throughout fights like A3 and A4. And then they throw the curveball of stuff like increased duration to hypercharge and doubling the effect of it from 5% to 10%. It's like, okay, well, I see what Square Enix is trying to tell us, so we're going to abide and listen. Hypercharge was one of the defining factors of Midas, and one of the things that definitely shaped the rate at which the tier was cleared. Similarly to how we approach Gordias, let's look at each fight kind of individually. I don't want to spend too much time on A5, but let's just briefly look at what was good and what was bad about A5. What was good about A5 was that we are now escaping away from the tyranny and bindings of the circular arena. We are now away from the circular flat arena with no interaction whatsoever other than maybe a death wall. A5, they reintroduced interacting with the environment. The environment being the puddles that spawn around A5, around the arena in A5. This was a very good addition and really cool to see in their opening fight of the tier. For that reason, it's actually one of my favorite fights of the tier. What we saw in A5 was, at a very early stage, we saw a reduction in the tuning of DPS requirements. That was very noticeable when the top teams were clearing the fight in entry-level gear on their very first kills, not even seeing the entire final two phases. I remember our first kill, as soon as the Shapti spawned, the boss died. The fight was very clearly tuned for groups of all calibers to be able to walk in and after they learn the mechanics, they should be able to kill the fight. That's very clear when you go through the fight, and that's good. That's good for an entry level boss. Entry level bosses shouldn't be polarizing in that manner. They should just be learn the mechanics, give you the ability to kill the boss. Because then what that does is that gives teams a stepping stone. Teams, as they progress through the tier, are going to start encountering DPS walls, but the teams that are a little bit more casual in how they go about it, they can build their team up through acquiring gear and stuff from that entry-level boss, and that's really important for designing a raid tier. I've seen that play out through WoW. I've seen that play out through Final Fantasy, both games, where the more casual groups use the entry-level bosses to gear up and approach the harder bosses. And that's you need a fight like A5 that's clearable just by learning the mechanics. What was bad about A5? Honestly, not much. I think I really can't say too much bad about it. It was very mechanically interesting. The interaction with the environment, turning into a bird, the dynamic arrangement of the bombs. Was great. So it wasn't just a static set rotation. I think that I honestly can't say too much bad about A5. Maybe you guys will disagree and have some negative opinions about it, but I really don't have many negatives to say about it. So I'm going to move on to A6, where the list of negatives is going to be much longer. um, so A6 had potential. A6 was potentially going to be regarded as the best fight in the game. It had it all. It was some of the most interesting progression through a fight that the game had seen yet, in that you're progressing through 4 bosses. It was each boss had a unique flavor. Each boss tested different parts of your team. One boss may have tested your team's DPS. Another boss may have tested your team's movement. One boss tested your team's. I'm trying to think of what the third swindler would have tested. I mean, that's kind of like your coordination, your communication. It's more so coordination, getting people in the right places for their high lows and stacking for the enumeration. So each boss had a unique flavor and requirement to getting through it, and it was like it was the most interesting progression cycle where like you finish one fight and then you move on to the next fight, but if you die, you have to start all over. That was, I guess hearing me say it out loud, that's kind of how every boss in the game has ever behaved, but it was magnified, I guess we should say, in that fight. And it was strongly becoming my favorite fight, like, while we were progressing through it. And I know a lot of people feel the same way, that while they were progressing through it, it was just so fun to progress through until you got 3 bosses down. And then you see your friend Vortexer. I need a drink for this. It's kind of fitting that while I'm sitting here about to talk about Vortexer, I'm drinking from my Dasani water bottle. Water is a very interesting topic. The human body is made up mostly of water. So Vortexer was a very negative memory for a lot of teams, specifically the teams that were progressing on at week 1. It was the first time ever since Twintania, basically. Not since Twintania had there been a time in Final Fantasy where a portion of the fight was so badly broken that whether or not you survived it was completely not up to you. The only time I can think of anything similar to that was Twintania's Twisters. It was a boss where when you pulled it, you felt you had no control over whether you lived or died. And this was entirely due to the fact that the mechanic of compressed water was just beyond broken. It was beyond bugged. The mechanic is supposed to behave in such that the more people that you soak it with, the less damage it does. And whenever compressed lightning or compressed water go off, they leave a debuff. And what the debuff does is it increases your damage taken, to the alternate compressed debuff. And one of the parameters, one of the defining parameters of the fight, and in the designing and development of the fight, is that no player can have 2 of the same debuffs at the same time, because that is impossible to survive. You can never have the compressed water spawn on a player with a compressed lightning, and because it's just a wipe at that point. Because as soon as a player with the compressed debuff dies, it's a raid wipe. I forget it's like an auto clean. I think that's what the mechanic was called. The Vortexer basically auto kills your raid. If that ever happens, if you ever have compressed water player or compressed lightning player die, I'm actually blanking a little bit. I'm trying to remember if it was also if anyone hit by it died, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think you could have players hit by the water and die, and it didn't. I think that was fine. Punishing Wave. Thank you very much. Punishing Wave. So the bug of the fight was essentially that when the compressed water is passed, it can sometimes pass to a player with, uh, it can sometimes happen to a player, pass to a player that had the thunder debuff, and because of the way because of the way the fight was developed and coded, that was an auto wipe. That's just one of the parameters in the fight. It was like a checklist. If this occurs, wipe the raid. And for some reason, that could happen. This was a massive headache because, and I see this happening. I see this occurring in chat already, and I'm hoping that they're trolling, but there was no replicating it. There was no method to the madness. It was not like when you could not replicate the error in passing it to the wrong player, because there was no rhyme or reason to it. It was entirely random. It was not related to your position. It was not related to the people who were involved in the passing. It was not because people were passing with tanks. I can assure you that many teams in and out of Elysium tried every single combination of passes that you can imagine. With tanks, without tanks, with only tanks, with no tanks. There was nothing that was causing it other than there was just a line of code missing, saying that this can't happen. I think that I saw this in chat just now when I highlighted before I go on. One of the more interesting theories that we came up with during progression was that the machinist turrets were bugging it out, and having a machinist turret in the soak was bugging it out. And I remember the epiphany that we had when we thought of that, like, oh my god, it's the machinist turret. Let's get back to Vortexer right now. We've solved it. We figured it out. The only thing that was different between us and the other groups that aren't experiencing this problem is they don't have a machinist. They're running a bard. That must be it. It must be the machinist pet. We took the machinist pet out of the sack, and the same thing occurred. The interesting thing about it is we had another team in our FC, Team K-pop, who experienced the bug at a much less frequent rate than we did. And there was something occurring. There was something occurring that caused them to get it nearly 80% less often than us. But to this day, none of us nor the developers have given any reason for that. And I remember that towards the end of their kill, even it might have just been confirmation bias, because towards the end of their kill, I remember they started seeing the bug happen a lot more frequently as well. So it could just be a product of confirmation bias as well. There's just been nothing concrete about it. It's just an seemingly entirely random interaction. So that was an extremely annoying part of progression, and turned one of my favorite memories of a fight into quite possibly my most hated memory of a fight of all time in any MMO ever. I'm being serious about that. My memories of progressing through A6 are about as negative as they come. And it's because I just felt I had no control over my outcome. That being said, progression through A6 became a grueling process of pulling until you got the god pull of the RNG favoring you so that the bug never occurred. And lo and behold, that's what happened. I think every team that cleared it week 1 had to play that way. We just chain pulled until we got the stars aligning, and that's it. The conclusion to that, to the A6 story arc, is that I believe if not the beginning of week 2, I can't remember if it was the beginning of week 2 or the beginning of week 3, and somebody in chat might be able to correct me. I believe it was the beginning of week 2. They hot fixed it with a very, very, very deflecting line in their patch notes of something along the lines of resolved an issue where Vortexer was not behaving as intended, or something like really deflecting after a full week of people saying that we were crazy. I don't know. I think it was week 2. It might have been week 3. It might have actually been week 3. You're right, because I remember when we had to re-clear, there was a lot of stress in our re-clear of, oh my god, are we going to be able to get through this? Yeah. So that was A6. We talked a lot about what was bad about it. We talked a bit about what was good about it. Looking at the DPS, look at the party compositions. A6 is a fight where you have different classes shine in different moments. I think class balance wise, with the exception of Machinist versus Bard. I think the classes were in a pretty good spot through the majority of Midas, and you're going to see this a lot when I start talking about A8. The overall balance of the game, with the exception of two things, with the exception of Warriors and with the exception of Machinists, was pretty good. Summoners were also very poorly represented. My fault by Summoner companions in the chat. Summoners were very underloved in Midas. So, 3 jobs highlighted as being outliers of Midas progression. Warriors, Machinists, and Summoners. 2 of them being overtuned and 1 of them being undertuned. Let's look at A7 now. A7, we're revisiting one of my favorite things about A5 was, and that is the interaction with the environment. The interaction with A7's environment came in the shape of you had spikes coming up and out of the ground, and you had these cages that you had to interact with, and where we've again migrated away from the circular arena. And we've gotten into more interesting encounters and fight designs again, which is great for the growth of the game. I think that going into Midas was actually one of the things I highlighted on when I was on I think it was on Mog Talk or State of the Realm. I wanted to see them utilize the environment more. I wanted to see things that were similar to how Turn 1 from Binding Quill behaved, where you had these varying levels of heights on platforms and stuff, and I really wanted to see them experiment with that again, even though they said that they would never do that again after Turn 5 because of the Z-axis abusing that happened. So I was really happy to see in Midas that they kind of got back to having some balls and trying new things in regards to the environment. So far we still haven't seen anything related to Z-axis interaction yet, and that I think is where they're a little too scared to touch. Just because they saw what we did to Turn 1 and Turn 5 in Binding Coil. A7, back to A7, like I highlighted, the environment, the interaction was great. This is them getting a little bit more ballsy with their fight design in that regard. And that was really good to see. It gave me a lot of hope for how the tier was going to end, actually. Because the whole way you're going through Midas, you're just hoping, I really hope this is better than Gordias. I really hope this is better than Gordias. We're trying to win back the game. We're trying to win back the raid scene and build a new raid scene after we lost the entire raid scene to Gordias. So everyone was just putting all their faith in Square Enix. Please make Midas good. Please make Midas good. And for the most part, I think they did. With the exception of the A6 bug, up to this point in A7, Midas was great. It's really fun. Mechanically, very, very fun. The class balance, with the exception of the 3 that I highlighted earlier, is well represented. A7 was where you saw a shift, where you saw a fork in the road of team compositions. You had our team favor the Paladin Monk variation, whereas you had other teams stick to the tried and true DPS comp built from Gordias of the Dark Knight Dragoon Ninja. And Midas was a tier that wasn't as tuned as tight for DPS, so you could kind of go back to some of the old school playstyles of favoring defense before offense. And that was it was refreshing because it wasn't so on the other side of the spectrum as Realm Reborn was, where it's like if you only focus on defense you can kill a fight. Midas still had some of lighter DPS checks that you couldn't just ignore your uptime for. You had to you could change it was tuned to a point where you could change your party composition to be more defensive, but you could not change your uptime. And you still had to focus on maximizing your uptime and maximizing your buff uptimes and utilizing your buff synergies across your team. That was still a primary focus. The only thing that Midas allowed for was a little bit more class flexibility. So that was great. One person in chat is highlighting that the tank cage in A7 was bugged the first couple weeks, where there was the LOS method. I do remember that. Funnily enough, me being the tank, and I kind of kicked myself for this. I didn't actually, on our very first kill of A7, I didn't realize that the thing was LOSable. I'm pretty sure. I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure on our very first kill of A7, I did not LOS the tank cage because I didn't know it was a thing. I think I found it on accident on our second kill, where I walked through it and the castbar stopped, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm an idiot. I can't remember if that was between the first and second kills or sometime before the first kill. But I remember feeling like an idiot. where were we with A7? We talked about the tuning of the fight allowed for flexibility in class composition, which was I think is really good for the game. I think the reason why I need to highlight the reason why I think that it's really important for the game is that this is not the final boss of the tier. This is the third boss of the tier. This is what Living Liquid could have been. You know, this really interesting mechanically driven fight that isn't so polarizing in class composition. A7, with the exception of how A6 played out, maybe A6 was a little bit too difficult and a little bit, the bug was annoying and stuff. A7 is a great third fight to a tier. There's a lot of mechanics, a lot of phasing. Let's think about the equal responsibility thing that we talked about earlier. Is there equal responsibility across the fight? To my knowledge, yes. I mean, there's some pretty serious requirement for tank swaps when you're at an early gear level. Obviously when you're full 240 back then, I don't think you needed the tank swap at all. You just blitz through the phases so quickly that the vulnerabilities just like fall off you, I think, or you can use immunities to get through the parts that they don't. I remember when Vox and I were doing it, I can't remember when we were full gear ever really caring about tank swaps. Is there equal responsibility between the tanks? Yeah, for the most part. I think the cage interaction and stuff, while the tank outside needs to focus on keeping the boss position and mitigating the tank busters, the tank inside the cage needs to focus on doing his job. During the ball phase, definitely a lot of responsibility across two tanks. They're not necessarily the same responsibilities, but there's responsibilities for both tanks, which is something that we won't see in one of the fights I'm going to talk about in a second. Let's think about the healers. Healers by far equal responsibility. You had your healers having to coordinate sides of the map they were standing on, who's going in what cage, who's healing what tank busters. The strengths of White Mage were definitely shown throughout the entirety of A7. Just the overall throughput really carried. DPS wise, I think the one thing that we should comment about the DPS, and I know Rinchan's in the chat, he may remember this, and other bards and machinists who went through the tier will definitely remember this. The ranged DPS role, for whatever reason, really did not have to interact with many mechanics in that fight. And I think that's probably a product of how we as players decided to progress through the fight. I know that we utilized our melees a lot more for dealing with mechanics more so than our ranged, but that's just because the melees were far better suited for it. So it's as a ranged DPS, it really was kind of just a target dummy for those players. I think the most important thing as a ranged DPS was making sure that you were standing in the right position, and that I think is probably something that they could have done a little bit better, because everything else was just kind of really evenly split among the roles. Before I continue, okay, sorry, I had to take care of something real quick. So where were we? We talked about some of the things that were good, some of the things that were bad. One of the things being bad was maybe the range DPS responsibility. Is that really all we want to talk about A7? It was a really interesting, I think, mechanically fight. I think that maybe the DPS check for some of the more hardcore teams was viewed maybe a little easy, but in my 1.5 year removed reflection of the tier, I think it was fine. I think it gave the overall player base a mechanically taxing fight that did not feel out of reach in terms of meeting the DPS requirement. And there are plenty of teams that saw the Enrage. I don't think I personally, I can't remember if I saw it in Rage. I think I saw it in Rage once and it was at about 8%, but it was only because we had people dead. I think for the hardcore teams, maybe they would have liked to see a little bit more of a DPS check. But for the overall player base, I think Square Enix hit it right. Which brings us to now our final fight of the tier, Brute Justice. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about with Brute Justice. So much so that there's I should probably take notes while I'm going through this, just because there's so much to talk about. You know, the going into Brute Justice, let's first examine the class compositions that were utilized throughout Brute Justice. If we think about the tanks, when I think about Brute Justice, and this is definitely a reflection of where my mind was at for tanking, having just coming out of A7. When I looked at Brute Justice, I was favoring a composition of Warrior and Paladin, because I saw the tier so far as being, so long as we maximize our uptime and utilize our cooldowns properly, we should favor defense. And that's sort of how I was approaching Midas as I was seeing it. A lot of teams had a different philosophy of, well, if you're existing in that world, then the opposite is true, in that the more DPS you have, because of the fact that Square Enix has given you a lighter DPS check to allow for shifting in group compositions, that in turn makes the strong DPS comp variants able to get through phases at a much quicker rate, and sometimes even bypass mechanics entirely. I don't think Brute Justice was undertuned so much to the point of where one composition was skipping mechanics that another composition wasn't. To my knowledge, I can't think of any mechanic that we skipped in the first week of Brute Justice progression that other teams weren't skipping. So I think that it was a pretty good balance, you know, when I think about it that way. You know, because that is the question you have to ask yourself. You know, is this fight tuned so low that if we bring this other composition, do we skip parts of the fight? You know, that's one of the defining questions that you ask yourself when you're deciding what classes you want to bring to a fight. And when I think about Brute Justice, I really can't think of that being the case ever. So I think, you know, having said that, Brute Justice was tuned great. Is it possible that Brute Justice is their best tuning ever? It's possible. This is the end fight of a tier. This is a tier that this is a boss that, personally speaking, I feel was killable without weapons. The ending to that story is that unfortunately the boss didn't die until people had weapons, but the boss I really feel was killable without weapons if played perfectly. And with that knowledge and everything else I said, what's stopping us from saying that this is the best tuning that they've ever done in a fight? Both DPS and HP wise. I'm having a hard time disputing that amongst myself. So that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to say Brute Justice is the best tuning they've done. Now, does that make Brute Justice the best fight they've ever done? No. By far, no. Brute Justice is a very favorable memory of mine, but I am not ignorant to the many problems that Brute Justice had. And for that reason, I'm going to start with what was bad about Brute Justice. Because these are things that I want fixed for Stormblood. I don't want to see encounters have these types of problems again. One of the first issues with Brute Justice is the very, very apparent lack of equal responsibility. I'm going to skip ahead to the final phase of Brute Justice to make my point. The entire last phase of Brute Justice, you know, most commonly known as Winged Justice, is almost it's almost objectively better handled by one tank. The minute you start incorporating your off tank into sharing the responsibilities that your main tank has, it just makes things more complicated. When the simplest method of getting through a fight is having one tank do everything, that's bad. We had our Dark Knight essentially handle the entirety of the last phase and put all of the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had to position the boss, he had to keep us alive from chakrams, he had to handle the tank busters, he had to do all of that, which was such a much larger responsibility than anything else that anybody else was doing. The off tank in that fight really did not see nearly the same responsibility that the main tank had. And I remember feeling during progression that that was really dumb. Uh, we had just gone through so many fights where that wasn't the case. We went through A6, we went through A5, A7. All these fights had great equal responsibility. And then we get to A8 where it's just like they just forgot that that was important. I don't know if it's they saw the phase panning out differently than the entirety of their player base did, which is a possibility. But it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, the best way to get through the fight was to put all the responsibility on one player's shoulders. That's just not good raid design. It's just really not. What does that do to raid teams? I mean, I can't think of any raid team who didn't get mad at their tank at one point or another for screwing up, and then you need a voice of reason to come in and be like, I mean, guys, we need to take this with a grain of salt. What he's doing is infinitely more difficult than what we're doing. And then, hopefully if you're a level-headed team, you'll understand that. But I know a few of my friends' teams were not nearly as level-headed, and roster swaps occurred based over just that simple fact alone. I mean, it was just ridiculous. So that, I think, was something that they filled out with A8. It's something that I hope going into Stormblood they address. I think equal responsibility across roles is really important to me. I think it's really important to players across the board. So the other negative about A8 that's been beat to death at this point, and because I've already been mad about it over A6, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but we saw once again, issue with compressed water. Compressed water in A8 was in my eyes, the defining mechanic of the fight. It was the most difficult mechanic to maneuver and survive, and one of the unfortunate things in A8 was that the mechanic was entirely bypassable through something that we all knew and hated from A4, another sack strat. You could just sacrifice players and, entirely skip hard portions of the fight. I thought that was really unfortunate. I had fully expected that they had learned from A4. How could they make the same mistake again? I mean, come on. So that takes away a lot for me from A8. Just those two things alone really make it so that I can't say that A8 is their best fight ever. But I can confidently say I think that it's their best tuning they've ever done. So I said I wasn't going to talk about it a lot, so I'm not. So I'm going to move on. Let's think about what was good about the fight. There's a lot of things that were good about the fight. One of my favorite things about the fight was just how damn fun it was. It was just such an entertaining fight. Thematically, it was just so fun. This fucking Voltron forming, and then the music shifts, and you're pumping up your volume and putting that shit on max, and just dancing while you're doing your DPS rotation. I thought it was so fun, man. A8 was our first interaction with a council fight, a council phase in Final Fantasy. You had the second phase of A8 was Final Fantasy XIV's first true council encounter, with the four robots that you dealt with. The opening part of the fight, while it was kind of like a prologue fight. Brute Justice doesn't start until like the 5th minute into the fight, or maybe in progression it was the 7th minute. But I think it was like the 5th minute of the fight. You need to get through 5 minutes of the fight before you even see Brute Justice. So I feel like the first two phases are sort of like the prologue, and they're just kind of like building you up to the fight. They're setting the stage, and that's why Onslaughter wasn't like a true DPS check. You just kind of do the mechanics, and he pushes over, he falls over. But you had the really cool introduction of a mechanic that requires a lot of group coordination in legislation in Phase 1, and that to me was the thing that made this a final boss of a tier. This mechanic that really put a lot of pressure on you, and it put a lot of pressure on you right out of the fucking gate. This was a fight that was just like, it was not like, well, you're gonna be able to get through half of the fight really easy, and then you'll figure out the rest of the fight as you go. No, this was a fight where you finally get through A7, your team is ready to go, and then they say, pause, your progression stops here, back to the drawing board, and you're solving of legislation. So I thought that was a cool way to start a fight, and one thing that really elongated A8 progression. And at the ad phase was just a monster in how it was coordinated and mapped out and stuff. Also, the other cool thing about the ad phase was figuring out the order in which you need to kill the robots. Just a great opening 2 phases. Fantastic. They built up to the final encounter with Brute Justice, which was the penultimate finale to the tier. And I just thought that was fantastic design. The Brute Justice phase itself, Brute Justice was a fight where we saw our first, I'm going to use a WoW term, we saw our first mythic phase. It was a fight that was Savage only, or it was a phase that was Savage only, specific to Savage only, and one thing that you could not prepare for going through normal, which I thought was really cool. One thing in Midas that they did with normal that was a little bit different than Gordias was the normal modes kind of introduced you to everything, but then in Savage modes were not about learning the mechanics, they were about progressing through multiple mechanics at the same time. So that was, I think, really cool. And then the introduction of a new phase that wasn't even in normal was sort of like okay, you got this far going with that philosophy. Now we're gonna give you a different flavor, and let's see you get through this. And then the final phase, Wing Justice. We kind of already talked about some of the things that we have negative feelings about, but the idea behind it of like having a final phase that sort of you're not prepared for was really cool. And then I could do an entire stream on the mechanic that is gavel that you find in the beginning of the final phase. We really don't have time to talk about today, but gavel, just in short, amazing mechanic, one of the greatest mechanics that they've come up with in a final tier boss, in a final boss of a tier. Anyway, that's sort of what we have to talk about for Midas. We've hit the goods, the bads, the things we didn't like, the things that we don't want to see again. I think it's time that we move on from Midas. We've got about a little over an hour left in the stream, I think, before I got to wrap things up. So I want to use this remaining hour to go over the remainder of the expansion and go over the some of the overall opinions on what we want to see in Stormblood. And before people make fun of me for having Skype open again, I'm just going to log off. There, what now? So let's think about where the game headed after Brute Justice. I don't want to get into Creator just yet, but let's think about where the game headed. We first have, before 3.4, we have 3.3, obviously. 3.3 was a patch that is very important to the history of Heavensward. It was a patch where it was the beginning of their, maybe not the beginning, but it was just another chapter in their novel of completely overdoing it with buffing the class. And people who remember 3.3 will know that I'm speaking specifically about Bard. 3.3 featured Bard buffs that were meant to put them on a playing field level with Machinist, because of the over-buffing that they did to Machinist in Midas. Machinist was so much more popular than Bard throughout Midas that their reaction was not to bring Machinist down to Bard's level, but to buff Bard in the same drastic measures. And this is very important because this is when the game starts to shift. This is when you have these party compositions that are so stacked in DPS, synergy, and utility that they are doing things that the developers did not plan for. And honestly, with the what we saw happen in 3.3 and 3.4, did not see coming. They did not plan for it, and they just were not aware that it was even going to be a threat. And that's very obvious. The buffs to Bard, you could almost think of Bard sort of became like the AD carry, if you want to think of it in like league terms. Like they became the main carry of your team for a while. Like Bards did so much damage in 3.3 that you made sure that you had a Dragoon, a Ninja, and a Machinist to support the Bard. And then the Bard obviously brings the foes for your healers. And there's just so much DPS stacking of synergies in that composition that it became a powerhouse real quickly. Casters became less and less important. The triple ranged. If you weren't running a triple ranged, chances are you were probably not running a caster if you were insistent on min-maxing your damage. I know that's not true for everything that happened in 3.3, but I think it's a fair enough, and people can agree. I think it's fair to say that the two prominent DPS compositions were either the triple ranged variant or the quad physical double melee double ranged variant. I think those were really the strong comps. And this is only going to get worse. This just gets magnified and snowballs out of control in 3.4. And this leads us into 3.4 with, and I'm gonna try to remain objective. I have to preface going into this that I am very critical of 3.4. I will highlight what I liked about 3.4. However, I have not made it unapparent to my following and anyone else who reads what I say that I am critical of 3.4, because the large gains to DPS synergies that had been building up to this point completely snowballed out of the developer's control when, for whatever reason, they looked at our little snowflake friend. Remember that thing that I talked about at the very beginning of Heavensward that I said I'm not gonna talk about this. It's a complete waste of time to talk about this until later. Well, Square Enix saw that. They saw that nobody was talking about their card magicians. Nobody was buying their packs. So they did what is, in my opinion, the worst thing that they've done to Heavensward throughout the entirety of it. And they completely overhauled the Astrologian class by not just buffing, but doubling the two strongest components of it in the double of bowl and balance. Now, if this were any other patch, say this was 3.1, say they doubled balance and bowl back in 3.1, is that a massive change? Yes. Would we see more Astrologians? Yes. It pales in comparison to being icing on the cake to all of the changes that they made up to this point. All of the changes that made all of the other DPS classes powerhouses are magnified by what they did to Astrologian. And this is the beginning of the snowball. And this is where I'm going to be highly critical of Square Enix. And I know that I am the vocal minority in this. But what I asked Square Enix to do for Stormblood is to go beyond my request. Obviously, my request is too ignorant. But I want them to look beyond my request and find a balance that works for all parties involved. I do not like massive changes such that of the caliber that they did to Machinist, Bard, and Astrologian the day that raid tiers are released. I myself, as a progression raider, do not like that. I know that other teams that I speak to do not care for it either. Now, Square Enix's focus is on the mass player base, and for the mass player base, putting in big changes like that into their big content patches is sort of an appealing draw. It feels like a new content patch is a big shift to how they view the game, and that's fine. What I ask Square Enix to do is to find a healthy medium. I don't have the answer for them. I know that in WoW, Blizzard struggles with the same thing. They don't have a great answer either. Until recently, I won't make this into a WoW stream, but until recently, they've now stagnated their raid releases. So raids are actually not released on big content patches, which Square Enix may want to look into. Hey, that's an idea. Go the WoW route. It works. It's been working great so far. In terms of class balance, with the exception of some things that Blizzard has fucked up. I'm not going to deny that the class balance is imperfect. Uh, the uh, I just ask that they find a medium for Stormblood that sort of helps both parties. So what did this big snowball do? Well, Square Enix in all their glory of designing Midas and the great job they did with tuning Midas, decided that the clear rates were still not where they want them to be. So what they did to compensate for that is they tuned Creator a little bit easier. They made the checks a little bit lighter, and that's fine. Honestly, as hardcore as speaking from a hardcore audience, I don't mind that. You know what? As easy as they want to make the game, that's fine. Whatever keeps people in playing and enjoying the game, I don't care. I look back at a tier like Final Coil, which was honestly very similar to Creator in terms of tuning, and I look back at Final Coil favorably. It's not about how easy or difficult a fight is. It goes well beyond that. It's about the progression through a fight and making sure that progression is interesting, and making sure that it's also tuned at a rate that isn't so high that it's not fun. And I think that's the important thing. So they made Creator a little bit easier in terms of DPS checks and HP checks, and that's okay. Here's the problem. I don't think that they realized what the changes they did to Astro are going to do to the rest of the game. Because, and I'm very rarely critical of Square Enix's foresight in this regard, because I do like to give them the benefit of the doubt, with few exceptions being, the stuff I talked about earlier, with regards to catching up to the player base, and also this specifically. I do like to give them the benefit of the doubt. I have trouble giving them benefit of the doubt here. I think that they really just did not understand how large of an impact these astrology changes were going to have on the player base. I don't know if it was because they were checked out of Heavensward and they just wanted people to have fun and do big numbers while they wait for Stormblood. I mean, it's possible. I would like to believe that that's not the case. I think that they just didn't anticipate it, because what I'm referring to is, because they made the tuning of Creator easier to increase raid participation, this coupled with the massive snowball of the astrology changes made it so teams of all calibers were blazing through fights. I mean, blitzing through fights at a rate the game has never seen before. I am not just talking about your world first raiders. I am talking about people who raid 3 days a week. People who raid 12 hours a week are blitzing through encounters, skipping phases. That's unheard of for a week 1 casual team to be skipping phases at entry levels of gear. There's no way that is something that we can say is good for the desire to continue raiding. And when they talk about their tuning of Stormblood, a lot of times they say, oh, we feel that we really hit the mark right with Creator. We really like where Creator ended up tuning-wise. When I think about that, there's a couple ways I could look at that. I could look at that, is this in relation to how the tier ended up post-Astrologian? Or is this related to, if you take away the Astrologian and look at the tier, say the Astrologian didn't exist, say that you went through the tier with Scholar and White Mage, how does the tier unfold? Well, history shows that the teams that ran White Mage and Scholar and did not run Aster still cleared at rapid rates. World 2nd and World 3rd teams were both White Mage and Scholar. I'm sorry, the World 3rd raid clear was not. I can't remember what Renos' team ran. I apologize for that. But the point that I was trying to make is the upper echelon is still going to see extremely fast clear rates, just because the tuning of the difficulty does not really define the rate at which they clear. What this affected most was the rest of the player base. If we look at the rest of the player base, had they been forced into running White Mage and Scholar, I don't think we would have seen nearly as many week 1 kills of bosses as we did. I think Astrologian catapulted some groups' pulls into skipping mechanics that were actually difficult to manage. the yeah, I think that when I speak about 3.4, I think that that is how I would classify it, as the changes most negatively affected the raid scene that is the mass populace. And I don't think, personally speaking, and people can disagree with me. I know this is sort of an opinion piece right now. Personally speaking, I don't think that that's good. I think that players enjoy being challenged. You know, I'm raiding 12 hours a week in WoW right now, so I'm one of the casuals, and I enjoy the fact that Nighthold took us 7+ weeks to get through. I felt very fulfilled when we killed Gul'dan. I imagine that if I were to do the same thing in Final Fantasy, I would have felt very similarly to the killing Brute Justice or Alexander after weeks of working through it at a reduced schedule. When I think about how fast some of these teams cleared, and when I've spoken to how fast some of these teams that have cleared fast, that are rating at a lower, more light schedule, a lot of them feel the same way that's most of the hardcore teams do, and that they don't feel a very large sense of fulfillment. You know, you look forward to raids for months and months and months, because, you know, obviously we have content drought in Final Fantasy sometimes when it comes to raiding, just because of the way the game is designed. You know, sometimes it's 6 months in between a raid, or even more. You know, we're looking forward to these new fights and the weeks of enjoyment and entertainment that it's going to bring us. And then if we just blitz through it like that, it's like, that's it. This is all we got. You know, obviously the development cycle of the fight was large, but it's a shame that the fights themselves leave players wanting more, when the developers clearly worked extremely hard on fights like A11 and A12. There's tons of work that went into that. That's very evident, and they're honestly designed very well. They have very interesting mechanics. The problem is that they're not fulfilling because they just fall over, and that's a product of the snowball that Square Enix has constructed leading up to this point. And I just feel that that's really unfortunate. It's unfortunate on both sides. It's unfortunate for the players, and it's unfortunate for the developers. So when I think about every time Yoshida references the fact that 4.0's raid is going to be tuned similarly to Creator, I hope that means Creator sans Astrologian and the snowball that Astrologian created, because I'd be okay with that. I just can't get behind a tier that was completely demolished by a snowball that was 4 patches in the making, and I just think it's unfortunate. So I'm sorry that I'm overly critical about 3.4. I wish I wasn't, but yeah, I just don't feel the same fulfillment out of killing the last boss that I did in previous tiers, and I really want to feel differently in Stormblood. And I think I speak for a lot of the people in the chat right now and the people watching that we want to have that feeling of achievement and accomplishment back, because that's important to us as raiders. That's why we do it, right? It's for that final moments when you see the boss's HP going from 3% to 2% to 1%. It's like that adrenaline, that feeling of accomplishment is overwhelming you. Like, oh my God, we did it. We came together and accomplished our goal. And it's this rewarding feeling that you find so little throughout your like everyday life. You know, there's very few moments throughout a month where you can, just in everyday life, where you can have that same sense of accomplishment. It's like you know, when you get a test back. I'm in school right now, so this is very relatable to me. When I get a test back that I was very worried about and I do really well on it, I just feel empowered. It's a feeling of empowerment, and that occurs in games. You know, whether people feel that it's just a game or not, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the way it makes you feel when you're playing it. So I think that's important, and it's something that I want to see again. It's something I want to see reflected in Stormblood for sure in Omega. So I'm not going to talk too much about the fights themselves in Creator, just because Creator is very relevant right now. You guys are probably clearing Creator on a daily basis, so you guys know how the fights work. You guys know how they're panning out. You guys know what classes are viable and what aren't. I'll just highlight a little bit about some of the meta revolving stuff beyond Astrologian. I think that the the tank balance is not quite where it needs to be yet. I want to see the balance between tanks addressed in Stormblood. I am a warrior main, however, I want to see Paladins and Dark Knights both brought up to the level that warrior is. Dark Knight's really strong right now. Paladin's almost there. I think yeah, I think that nerfing warrior down to their level would be less interesting to me than bringing the other two up to warrior's level. I see a comment from Easy in the chat that I will get to in a second about Zervin. Primals are something that I haven't really spent much time talking about on the stream, mostly because of time constraints. I only have a two and a half hour window to do the stream, and I didn't think I'd be able to do it if I focused on primals. But yeah, we'll talk a little about Zervin, because Zervin's relevant to the times as well. DPS wise, I think again right now we're still seeing the byproducts of the bards and machinist buffs. Bards and machinists and the quad physical DPS comp is still extremely strong. Casters are kind of glanced over when you're thinking about speed kills, unless it's a very specific situation. I think when I think of specific situations, I think back to like A8 speed kills, where certain casters made the I'm trying to remember exactly. This is an awful topic for me to bring up because my memory's so hazy. But I remember there was a reason why we did enjoy bringing a Black Mage to an A8 speed kill, because of something it did in Phase 1 and allowed for some timing push that wasn't available to another composition. I think there was another composition that had a little bit too much ramp up time, and we didn't hit the timing window that we wanted. Anyway, I'm going to move away from that before I embarrass myself. Yeah, so like I said, I'm not going to harp too much on Creator. I've sort of already said everything I want to say about it. I've said things that I want to see happen in Stormblood that are different from Creator. I think I'll highlight real quickly the things I liked about Creator. I liked the encounter designs. I thought when I was going through it in the initial 48 hours LOL progression cycle, I thought that the fights of A11 and A12, the encounters and the mechanics in the encounters themselves were interesting. I thought that the dynamic phasing of A11 at a very low gear level was interesting. It became utter nonsense when we got full gear, but at a very low gear level, I thought it was fine. I think A11 could have been tuned a little bit tighter. I would have liked to see it a little bit of a tighter tune. So yeah, I want to see them continue to explore mechanics being the primary interest in the fight, and get back to environmental interactions like we saw in A11, A7, A5, A10, fantastic environmental interactions. I really want to see stuff like that at least occur once a tier, for sure. Yeah, so that's Creator. Katko was talking about in chat earlier, can we talk about Zervin a little bit? And I'll speak to it very quickly because it's the most recent quote-unquote content that Square Enix has given us in a major content patch. And Zervin, I hope, is a sign of things not to come. I'll be honest, I'm going to be critical again. Zervin is a fight that we threw together a pug, well, it was not an entire pug, it was about 6 members of a static and then 2 pugs. We put together a squad where all 8 individuals were not familiar with how they did progression. We walked in and we killed Zervin on extreme difficulty in 3 pulls. I think that's obnoxious. If you're going to release an encounter on a filler patch as premium content for people to do while they're waiting for the next patch, it can't die in 3 pulls. I'm sorry, just can't. I don't care how talented the group is or isn't. The issue was that there was not the issue was that it was again a lack of foresight in the fact that teams with very snowballed DPS synergies are going to be skipping entire phases and mechanics, and the fight is going to fall over like a ragdoll. I really, really, really implore that they have more foresight about this going into their designs of Stormblood, and I hope that the changes that they make in 4.0 regarding class balance are going to make it so these snowballing synergies are not a thing anyway. because they, at the end of as we've seen, and this was one of the reasons I did the stream, was the progression from 3.2 to 3.3 to 3.4, and even starting with 3.1. We started with 3.1 when we reduced TP costs across the board. All the way from 3.1 to 3.4, things have just been snowballing worse and worse and worse in regards to DPS synergies. And they need to hit the reset button going into Stormblood. They really do. Otherwise, we're just going to see history repeat itself. And maybe even at a worse rate than it is right now. So, yeah, that's all I'm going to say about Zervin. 3.5, I don't have much to say. Truth be told, I haven't played much of 3.5. I don't think I've logged in very much since Zervin died. I understand that some of the content that's been released since then was the diadem and something involving an Ultima inside a Dune Scathig or whatever the hell that raid is called that fell over in one pull. So I'm not even going to waste my breath because neither of those things are worth talking about. The only thing that I'll say is that I want to see a little bit more focus on making primals a more enjoyable alternative means of content. Woo! Okay, so we went through all 3 Alexander raids. Give yourselves a clap, stream. You survived me talking for nearly 2 hours now. I'm sorry that I didn't take as many breaks as I sort of initially advertised. I was watching the clock as I was going along and realized that time was running shorter and shorter, so we just kind of moved along. But yeah, I want to open up the stream now to basically discussing what you guys want to see going into Stormblood, what your guys' opinions of how Heavensward progressed in terms of rating. I want to thank the people. I really want to thank the people when at the start of the stream who donated bits, and I'll be honest, I've never really had that happen on my stream before, so I was a little bit taken back. But Rails, Alice, thank you guys very much for your kind offering, and it really makes me happy that people showed up today and supported what I wanted to do today. Because even though I don't play Final Fantasy as much as I used to, I still really enjoy the game and the community, and yeah, I want to continue to enjoy the game and the community, and I like all of you guys in the chat, I'm hoping for Stormblood to be better than Heavensward. So I want every patch to be better than the last. So if you guys can give me a moment to step away for about 90 seconds to grab a snack because I'm starving. If you guys have any opinions or comments about what we just went over for the last 2 hours, if you guys liked or disliked how I handled things, I want to hear that too. This is something that in my continued interest of Final Fantasy, I want to do stuff like this more often. I think about the things that I enjoyed doing in Final Fantasy, and I always get back to stuff like this. I like working with the community and analyzing the game and ways that we can improve the game and stuff of that nature. So thank you guys again for tuning in and hanging out today and sharing one of my passions. So give me about 90 seconds to step away and grab a snack. You guys can collect your thoughts.